Hi, my name is Justin Schupp. I'm the founder here at PatchMyPC. We develop a third-party application management solution that integrates into Microsoft Configuration Manager and Intune. In this video, we're going to be specifically talking about the built-in third-party software update catalogs feature within ConfigMgr, and more specifically, what will and what won't work in the scenario that you're running a software update point that is remote from your site server and it is not configured for SSL. So there's a lot of confusion about this. Specifically, we see it quite a bit within the ConfigMgr community, so things like Reddit, and we also see it quite a bit from our customer base, people that don't understand what will and what won't work. And to be fair, the docs are actually a bit misleading in the way they're written today. So for example, if we look at the section for third-party software updates, and it says additional requirements when the SUP is remote, it basically says in the docs that you have to have it configured for SSL. That's actually not correct in order for it to work. And we'll kind of work through what that looks like, and we'll submit an update to the docs to see if we can get this clarified. Now, the piece that will not work is for Configuration Manager to manage the WSUS signing cert. But this is easy to work around both for creating the signing cert as well as deploying it. And we'll actually walk through what that would look like if you did not want to switch your software update point to SSL, but you did want to use third-party software updates. All right, so let's jump into the scenario and we'll actually walk through this configuration. So in our lab, we have a site system that is remote from our site server. This is also running our software update point. And if we look at that configuration, we can see that the SUP is not required for SSL. So we're currently logged into our site server, which would be this machine. But if I jump over to that remote site system, we can see that it's running WSUS, and we can see that it is not configured to run in HTTPS. So this would be fully remote software update point running in HTTP. So what we're going to do is go ahead and enable the third-party updates feature by going to Sites, Software Update Point, and then we're going to jump over and enable third-party updates. Now, I'll choose this option for ConfigMgr to manage it, but one thing to note, this will not work, and we'll actually see what that means within the log file. So I'll go ahead and click OK. We're going to then jump over and trigger a software update point sync. So there's going to be a couple things that happen when we trigger that sync. If we go ahead and open up our wsyncmgr, this is going to be where we see that Configuration Manager cannot manage the WSUS signing certificate because the software update point is not running in HTTPS. So what that means is, in order to publish third-party updates, you do need to have a WSUS signing certificate in order to sign those updates to ensure they came from your environment. So to show you what that looks like, we do have a KB article. I will link this. We won't go super deep into this because I'll show you how to generate that. But just if you did want to have some background on what the WSUS signing certificate is used for, I'll include that resource in the description of the video. But what we'll do is, just to get that warning message, just so we could see that that doesn't work, just wanted to trigger that sync so you can see that. But now let's jump over to the site system, because this is going to be where the component that actually publishes third-party updates would be running on. So it would actually be running on wherever your software update point is installed. So in my case, it's under the CSMS and then logs folder will be where my site system logs are located. So the SMS ISV sync agent, this is going to be the log file where any third-party update publishing is going to happen. So for example, we can see that the component, it previously was not installed at all. So we can see that when I went through and I enabled that third-party update box, that's going to be where it kicked in here. So if we can see around 8:11, just a couple minutes ago, this is where we can see that they were actually enabled and it's running now. So we can see that kicking in. And we're not currently subscribed to any catalogs, but we can see that once we enable that feature, the third-party updates did start syncing and it downloaded the list of partner catalogs to ConfigMgr. So if we were to go back into the console and actually look, we can see that we don't currently have anything, but if I click refresh, we can see that it is in fact working. So what I'm going to do for this example, just so I can demo this a bit easier without a massive driver catalog, we're just going to add a custom catalog, and we'll just use our actual Patch My PC catalog, and then we'll call out some of the caveats that you have to account for in the scenario that you're not running in SSL mode with regards to the certificate. So let's just paste that in, and then next here, and then OK. So at this point, we've added a custom catalog. We could subscribe to any of these using the built-in feature. So let's go ahead and click subscribe. Like any catalog, you will have to say that you trust that vendor. So in our case, this would just be the certificate for Patch My PC that's signing the catalog. So you'll just have to accept and do next here. Now for the categories, what I'm going to do is enable Notepad++. So let's jump over here. Notepad++, and then next. In this case, this is where you can really automate things. So if you wanted to, you could say for the categories that I've enabled, I also want to stage the content. So what staging content means is that it's actually going to go out and download the full update file and publish it to WSUS, so you can then deploy that within Configuration Manager and download it to a deployment package. If you use the metadata only, you wouldn't actually be able to deploy the update until you come into the Config Manager console. You right-click the update and choose to publish content, because at that point, if you chose this option, it would only be a metadata-only update where it doesn't actually download the content from the third-party vendor like Notepad++ in this example. So I'm going to say I do want to download that so I can deploy it. I'll just keep the default. I won't sync on a schedule, but you would probably do this if it was production to keep your catalog up to date. And then we'll go ahead and choose next. There we go. So we've now subscribed to it in our console. So what we can do next is if we remote back into that remote software update point, and if we look at that same SMS ISV sync agent log, we can actually see it just kicked in and it's starting to download that third-party update catalog. In our case, the one from our Patch My PC catalog. So we can see that this is in fact working perfectly fine up to this point on an HTTP software update point. But we're about to see the issue that if you don't account for will happen with regards to the certificate. So what should happen, it's going to go through, it's going to sync the entire catalog. But then once the sync happens, it's going to see that we did detect Notepad++ for full content. So at that point, it's going to go try to download the update from the vendor and then publish it to WSUS. And that's going to be where we see that there's no certificate currently created in order for it to actually sign that catalog or that Notepad++ update. So we'll pause this for a minute and we should see that kick in a second. Okay, here we go. So we can see that once that catalog finished, it then said, hey, I need to publish Notepad++ with full content because it was enabled for that. But we can see that the issue comes into play is that it does not actually have a certificate for WSUS to sign the update. And that's going to come back to the point where it was unable to automatically generate it. So if we look back at that wsyncmgr log, this is essentially why it can't sign it. Because what would typically happen is if you enable third-party updates in the console and you enable the option for Configuration Manager to manage the cert, typically what would happen if there's no certificate for WSUS to sign third-party updates, it would automatically generate that certificate. But in this case, this is actually the piece that will not work, because in order for Config Manager to generate the cert on a remote software update point, that action would take place from a WSUS API that runs on the site server. So they don't want to have the WSUS API to generate the cert that could expose things like a private key going over HTTP. So this is the actual piece that will not work using the native feature within Config Manager, but the actual publishing and synchronization of catalogs will. The only thing that you have to account for is you need to generate the certificate on the WSUS server yourself. So if we go back into our software update point that's remote, this is where we would have to generate the cert. So typically what would happen, if you had a WSUS cert already, it would exist within the local certificate store, and then there would be a WSUS certificate store within here. Now, in our case, we don't have that yet. So there's a couple of ways that you can actually generate the cert. You can use a WSUS API actually directly from PowerShell. That would require you looking at the docs and kind of looking at what the API call is for WSUS. Or you could either use our publisher, which is what I'll demo today, the Patch My PC publisher. You could use this for free for this specific purpose. But this is how our Patch My PC customers will typically publish our third-party updates, as well as our applications to ConfigMgr, as well as Intune. So if you are one of our customers, you probably wouldn't necessarily be using the third-party catalogs node anyway. You would probably be using our tool, this tool here that allows you to come in and publish all the updates. But if you are trying to get this working for things like driver catalogs, or maybe you're looking at another vendor's catalog and you ran in this scenario, that's where this situation could come into play, where you could use our tool to generate the certificate. In addition to our tool, if you wanted to, you could also use System Center Update Publisher from Microsoft. Within the options, there's also an option there where you can generate a signing certificate for WSUS. In our case, though, what we're going to do is go ahead and generate a self-signed certificate. You can also import one from a certificate authority if you wanted to. That would just require you to go create the template and export it. But in this case, we're just going to use a self-signed one. There we go. So we can see that the certificate was now created. Now, just to be clear, this is the exact same method that we use for calling the certificate creation through the WSUS API as ConfigMgr would use when you enable that option to manage the cert. Assuming that it was working and you had HTTPS enabled, it's the exact same generation of the certificate. It would simply be using our method, which is local, which wouldn't expose that private key as compared to ConfigMgr. All right, let's see if we can get this refreshed. There we go. And we can now see that we do have the WSUS code signing certificate, and that's now in place. So what would happen at this point is if we went back into our console, if we run a software update point sync, we should see that Notepad++ update just show up in 1 second here. So let's go ahead and open our wsyncmgr, and we should see that Notepad++ update come in just a second. All right, so we can see the Notepad++ is now synced. So just to go ahead and try to republish this quicker, I can go back into my console. So this failed the first time because there was no certificate. If I go ahead and click on Publish directly in the console, what that's going to do is that's going to kick in the SMS ISV sync agent over on my remote software update point, and that's going to tell it to try to re-download and republish that update. So we can see that it actually just downloaded, it just kicked in. This is where it didn't work before, but now that the code signing certificate for WSUS was created using the publisher tool, we can see that the built-in third-party software updates feature within ConfigMgr is now working perfectly fine. So we can see it was able to download it, it was able to code sign it. But now the next thing to note, generally what would happen if you had the option for third-party updates enabled, and if ConfigMgr was actually successfully managing the certificate, which would be if that software update point was running in HTTPS, if it was remote, or if the software update point was on the site server, this would even work if it's not in HTTPS mode. It would actually automatically read that certificate and it would deploy it to any clients that you have as long as the client setting for third-party updates is enabled. So we'll take a quick look at that client setting. As long as this option is enabled, if it was successfully reading the cert, this would actually happen automatically via client policy. Now, in our case, since the software update point is remote and it's running HTTP, ConfigMgr is not going to actually be able to read that certificate and generate it, so clients will not get it automatically. So this is really where you have to think about how you want to deploy that cert. So you can either export the certificate from our tool, or if you wanted to, if you're opening up cert LM, you can also export it directly from that utility as well within cert LM. So we'll use this method, for example. So we just want to deploy the cert or export the cert. We do not want to export it with the private key because we would not want clients to be able to get the private key and then be able to sign stuff directly. This option is also configurable when you generate a new cert. you can choose whether or not you want to disable the private key to be exportable as well on your WSUS server. So we're going to export it without the private key. We can keep the default options here. And then I'll just call this WSUS signing cert and put on my desktop. And then OK. So this is the certificate that we actually need to make sure that clients and any servers that you want to install third-party updates on trust in order for this to work and clients to install updates successfully. Now, there are a few ways that you can deploy the WSUS signing certificate. So we do actually have, if you just Google deploy WSUS signing certificate, you should be able to hit one of our articles that talks about all the different methods that you have to deploy the signing cert. So in our case, we would not be able to use the built-in option using ConfigMgr because we are running in the scenario where it can't read that because it's not in SSL. So we have a couple of options. We could use a group policy. That's probably going to be one of the easier ones. If you do not have access to group policy, though, there is another option that we provide a KB on that explains how you could use a configuration item within ConfigMgr to deploy this certificate. In our case, we are going to use a group policy to deploy this certificate though. So if I jump over to my domain controller, what I'm going to do is I did copy that certificate I exported to that machine, and then I just pasted it over to the desktop of the domain controller. I am using the group policy snap-in. You could run this on any machine that has the GPO snap-in. And in our case, we do have a specific OU that I want to link for this certificate deployment. In your case, it might be something like if you wanted to deploy to all computers, which you probably would, you might want to link it higher. But just for this example, I'm going to link it here. So what you want to do to deploy this is you want to go under Policies, Computer or Windows Settings, Security Settings, Public Key Policies, and then we want to import this certificate into the trusted root of client. So if I just click Import, I can choose that certificate I exported. And then we want to repeat that step once it imports to trusted root. We also need it to be in trusted publishers, and this is going to be what makes the computers trust the certificate that you're using to publish third-party updates. So we're essentially replacing the method that you could use if you're using the built-in option for ConfigMgr manages the cert, and rather than deploying it using client settings, we're deploying it using a GPO. So this would essentially be the piece that would not work using the native ConfigMgr feature, and simply using a group policy or even a configuration item would be a quick way that you could work around this, and you could still certainly publish third-party catalogs and updates using the native in-console feature. You would just have to deploy the certificate using a different method like we showed here. I hope this video was helpful, and thank you for watching.